Have you ever felt the forest breathe? Some mornings in Montana, the mist hangs so thick you can almost see the pine trees exhaling, their breath rolling low across the land, touching everything with a damp, expectant hush. On one of those mornings, just as the sky began to shift from inky black to the bruised purple of early dawn, Emily Brooks pushed open her cabin door, letting the world rush in. The chill bit through her faded flannel as she stepped out onto the creaking porch. She paused, drawing in the sharp, earthy scent of wet needles and wood smoke. Shadow, her German shepherd, padded to her side, his aging body moving with a grace earned over a lifetime of patrols. His fur was peppered with gray, but his eyes, sharp, amber, always watching, remained the vigilant guardians Emily had come to trust more than anyone. Emily took a moment to survey her home. The cabin was a patchwork of repairs, the kind of place built for function and solitude, not for show. A pair of muddy boots waited beside the door, and a single lantern glowed inside, casting long, soft shadows. This life was simple, stripped down to the essentials, and it was lonely. Emily knew every board in the floor, every knot in the timber, every secret path in the surrounding forest. But since the accident took her husband, those secrets had turned into silent companions, filling the spaces where conversation used to be. She knelt to fasten Shadow's harness, her fingers moving with practiced care. "Ready, old boy?" she murmured, and Shadow's tail thumped once against the porch. Their mornings always began before sunrise. They'd walk the boundary of Glacier National Park, checking fences, looking for signs of trespassers, lost hikers, or injured wildlife. Out here, problems didn't come by phone. They came with claw marks on trees, trampled brush, or sometimes just a sense that something wasn't right. As they set off, the fog curled around Emily's boots, muffling sound and sight. The forest was alive with tiny noises, a distant woodpecker, the drip of melting frost, Shadow's steady breathing. Emily pressed deeper into the trees, letting Shadow set the pace. There was comfort in their shared silence. Sometimes she spoke to him. Mostly she just listened, to the forest, to the wind, to the small aches in her chest that never fully went away. Half a mile in, Shadow stopped. His ears flicked, nose working overtime. Emily felt a prickle at the back of her neck. "What is it?" she asked, scanning the tree line. A squirrel darted up a trunk, but Shadow ignored it, his body suddenly tense. He let out a low, uncertain whine, something Emily hadn't heard in years. She crouched, resting a hand on his back. "Easy. Show me." Shadow moved ahead, tugging gently at the leash, leading Emily off the trail and into a thicket where sunlight barely reached the ground. Each step seemed heavier. The silence grew, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Emily's heart thudded in her ears, and every sense sharpened, honed by years of facing the unexpected. Suddenly, Shadow lunged forward, barking sharply. Emily stumbled after him, fighting through the underbrush. In a small clearing, the fog thinned, revealing a sight that froze her in place. A patch of trampled grass, splattered with mud and something darker. Blood, fresh and wet. Shadow whined again, circling a spot near a fallen log. Emily's pulse hammered. Had a bear come through? Or was it a wounded elk? She reached for her radio but stopped. There was movement by the log. Shadow nosed gently at something, stepping back as a shivering form came into view. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Lying half-curled on its side was a mountain lion cub, thin to the point of starvation, its fur patchy and matted. It looked up at her with wide, golden eyes, terrified, yet too weak to move. Shadow froze, tense but not aggressive. The cub let out a pitiful, rasping cry. Emily's training warred with her instinct. Mountain lions were dangerous, unpredictable, and yet, this cub was no threat. She scanned the area for tracks, hoping, dreading, to see the mother's prints. There were none. Her mind raced. Procedure said to call for backup, keep her distance. But the cub's ribs jutted from its sides, its breathing shallow. She knelt, speaking softly. "Hey, little one, easy, easy." Shadow, as if sensing her intent, sat beside her, his eyes locked on the cub. For a long, tense moment, the three shared the clearing, wild, domestic, and human, united by uncertainty. Emily fumbled for her radio, hands trembling. "Dispatch! This is Ranger Brooks. I found an injured mountain lion cub, alone and in distress. Location." She rattled off the coordinates, her voice steadier than she felt. Then, almost without thinking, she dialed Ben Walker, the only wildlife rehabber she trusted. "Ben, it's Emily. I need you. Urgent. Bring a carrier. And hurry." Shadow stayed close as Emily waited, her nerves on edge. She whispered to him, to herself, to the cub, filling the silence with fragile hope. Somewhere deep in the woods, a crow called out, harsh and lonely, as if the forest itself was warning her. Today, everything would change. And in that moment, under the breathless hush of the pines, Emily understood. Sometimes, the wild didn't just need to be protected. Sometimes, it reached out for help. There's a kind of hush that settles in the forest after a discovery, like the world itself is holding its breath. Emily crouched by the mountain lion cub, her thoughts racing faster than her heartbeat. The little animal, no more than a few months old, trembled, flinching at every movement, every sound. Shadow stayed just beside her, his posture both alert and strangely gentle, ears pinned forward, tail low, eyes never leaving the cub. The fog still clung to the trees, curling between the trunks and turning every shadow into something uncertain. Emily pulled off her thick jacket, kneeling as close as she dared. Her voice was a careful whisper. "It's all right. I'm not here to hurt you." The cub's eyes darted from her to Shadow and back. She saw the wounds now. A deep gash across the shoulder, scrapes along the side, dirt caked into the fur. More than just a scrape with a rock. Something had done this on purpose. Her hands shook as she rummaged through her backpack for a soft towel and a water bottle. Shadow crept forward, tail wagging in slow, cautious arcs. "Easy, Shadow," Emily warned. To her surprise, the dog sat and lowered his head, his gaze softening. There was something unspoken in the way he looked at the cub, a recognition, perhaps, of shared fear, or maybe a memory of his own past pain. Emily gently dripped water onto a corner of the towel, inching forward. "Let me help you." The cub whimpered, shying away, but the exhaustion was overwhelming. Its head dropped, eyes fluttering. Emily's heart broke a little. Wild things weren't meant to be so helpless. She worked quickly, cleaning the worst of the wounds as best she could without causing panic. Blood matted the fur, and she noted the injuries. Too sharp, too precise for a simple accident. Shadow sniffed the cub, then pressed his nose against its flank, as if reassuring both the animal and himself. The cub's breathing slowed, some of the tension fading from its muscles. A sudden rustle behind her made Emily jerk. Out of the mist, Ben Walker appeared, boots squelching through the undergrowth, face set in a mask of focus and worry. He carried a battered animal carrier and a kit stuffed with supplies. His jacket was already wet, hair plastered to his forehead. I got here as fast as I could. Oh, Emily. She gave him a quick summary, her words clipped by urgency. Ben knelt, his movements calm and deliberate, examining the cub's wounds. This is no ordinary scrape, he muttered, tracing the edge of the gash. Could be a snare, maybe a steel jaw trap, damn it. Emily winced. She hated what that meant. Humans, out here where wild things should be safe. Can you help him? She asked, her voice small. Ben nodded. We need to get him back to your cabin. He's got a chance, but it'll be close. Working together, they lifted the cub, who let out a weak, frightened yowl as Shadow barked reassurance. The journey back was slow, cautious. Emily moved ahead, clearing brush and steadying the path. Shadow hovered protectively, every so often glancing back at their fragile cargo. Inside the warmth of the cabin, the world narrowed to just the three of them. Ben laid the cub, now christened Leo, on a thick blanket beside the hearth. Emily stoked the fire, the crackle and pop of burning wood filling the silence. Shadow curled up nearby, never taking his eyes off Leo, as Ben cleaned and dressed the wounds, whispering gentle encouragement. Emily poured coffee, her hands unsteady. The isolation of her life had always felt like a shield, but now the cabin was crowded with need, fear, and the raw edges of hope. She watched Ben work, saw the quiet determination on his face, the care in his touch. He was a man shaped by hardship, just like her, practical, reserved, and carrying scars that didn't always show. As dawn melted into day, Leo began to stir, his sides heaving with each breath. Emily and Ben watched for signs of improvement, their conversations hushed, every sound amplified in the tight space. Shadow shifted closer, his nose pressed against Leo's paw. The cub blinked, meeting the dog's gaze, and for a moment, something passed between them. A fragile, uncertain trust. Emily pulled out her old, battered journal and wrote, her words tumbling out in a rush of guilt and longing. Why couldn't she save them all? Why did the wild always seem to lose? She let the pen fall and looked up as Ben finished wrapping Leo's shoulder. We'll need to watch him all night, Ben said softly. He's fighting, but it's a coin toss. Emily nodded, her resolve hardening. We owe him that much. Outside, the forest remained unchanged, mist and pine and bird song, as if none of this mattered. But inside, the balance had shifted. Emily found herself leaning on Ben's quiet strength, letting him into a world she usually guarded fiercely. Shadow moved closer to Leo, resting his graying head on his paws. The two animals, so different, shared the warmth of the fire, a silent pact forming in their proximity. Emily, watching them, felt something inside her loosen, a knot she'd carried too long. Sometimes the wild chooses you, not the other way around. As the light faded, Emily and Ben sat shoulder to shoulder, speaking little, sharing coffee and the uneasy quiet of hope. The room was filled with the slow, rhythmic sound of breathing, human, dog, and lion. Outside, night fell, bringing with it the promise of new trials. But for now, for this one night, they were safe together. A patchwork family built by accident, compassion, and the fragile truce of the wild. And as she drifted into a shallow, watchful sleep, Emily promised herself that whatever it took, she would see this cub through. For the next several days, time inside Emily's cabin seemed to bend, stretching long and thin between moments of hope and hours of dread. Spring rain battered the windows, drumming a slow, steady rhythm as Emily, Ben, Shadow, and their fragile new charge, Leo, settled into a tense routine. Emily barely slept. Every few hours she rose from the old armchair, knelt by the fireside, and checked on Leo. The mountain lion cub drifted in and out of feverish sleep, shuddering at each touch, his breath rasping. His wounds had been cleaned and stitched by Ben's practiced hands, but infection lingered, curling like smoke around the edges of each raw scrape. Sometimes, Leo's body shook with chills. Other times, he yowled softly, lost somewhere between dream and pain. Shadow became an unlikely nursemaid, keeping vigil at Leo's side. The old shepherd rarely left his post except to nudge Emily for water or food. One night, Leo, racked with fever, whimpered until Shadow pressed close, sharing his warmth. Emily watched, amazed. Never before had she seen her companion so gentle, so attuned to the suffering of another creature. Still, doubt gnawed at Emily's heart. She remembered every animal she hadn't been able to save. The orphaned fawns, the foxes caught in traps, the birds with shattered wings. Some nights, she dreamed she was running through the forest, arms outstretched, always a step too slow to catch what needed her. In the dark hours, she poured these fears into her battered leather journal, the words ragged and uneven. How many more can I fail? Am I enough, even with Ben and Shadow beside me? Why does the wild have to hurt so much? Ben sensed her worry. On the third day, after a storm rattled the windows and soaked the land, he found Emily hunched over her journal, tears she thought she'd hidden streaking her face. He didn't speak right away, just set a mug of coffee on the table and sat beside her, his presence sturdy and calm. "Emily," he said quietly, "you can't blame yourself for the wild being wild, but you can keep showing up. That's more than most ever do." She nodded, brushing away the tears with the heel of her hand. "Sometimes it doesn't feel like enough." He gave her a half smile. "Sometimes it has to be." Leo's recovery was touch and go. Some days he seemed stronger, lifting his head, blinking at the world. Emily caught him once, swatting weakly at Shadow's tail, the beginnings of play glimmering in his golden eyes. Other days, he barely moved, and Emily braced herself for the worst. They fed him small amounts, first with a dropper, then, as he rallied, with bits of soft meat. Every bite felt like a battle won. Late one evening, thunder rolled over the valley, shaking the cabin to its bones. The storm howled, lashing the roof and flinging branches against the windows. Emily dozed in her chair, journal in her lap, while Ben tended the fire. Shadow lay between them, Leo curled against his broad flank. When the lightning flashed, Leo startled, his cry cutting through the wind. Emily woke instantly, gathering the cub in her arms, pressing his trembling body close. Shadow nudged her knee, laying his head atop her leg, a silent comfort, a reminder she wasn't alone. Ben watched them, his eyes soft in the firelight, and Emily felt, for the briefest moment, a kind of family forming in the storm's heart. The wild pressed at the walls, but inside the circle of warmth and worry, they found safety. But the world outside wasn't safe. Early the next morning, Ben donned his rain gear and left to check the edge of the woods, hoping to find signs of Leo's mother or the source of the cub's injuries. Emily waited, nerves frayed, as Shadow paced the porch, uneasy. Ben returned hours later, face drawn, holding a piece of wire in one gloved hand. "Trap," he said, anger tightening his voice. "A snare, not far from where you found Leo. Looks like it's been there for weeks. Illegal, brutal. I found blood and fur in the brush nearby. It's not just bad luck, Em. Someone did this. And there might be more out there." Emily felt her chest tighten. She'd seen the aftermath of such cruelty before. Wildlife torn, maimed, sometimes left to die slowly. It was a violation of everything she'd sworn to protect. Worse, it meant Leo's mother had likely fallen victim. Emily stood in the doorway, clutching the doorframe, heart pounding with helpless rage. "We have to check for other traps," she said, her voice steel. "And alert the authorities. I won't let this happen again." Ben agreed, promising to canvass the area with help from the local ranger team. But he knew as well as Emily that resources were thin. There were never enough hands to protect all the wild things that needed saving. That night, Emily watched Leo sleep, his sides rising and falling in slow, steady rhythm. Shadow curled around him, protective and fierce. Emily scribbled one last entry in her journal before surrendering to sleep. "He's still here. We all are. Maybe that's hope enough for now." In the darkness, as rain whispered against the glass and thunder rolled off into the distance, Emily finally allowed herself to believe that the battle wasn't lost. Not yet. The fight for the wild, for healing, for each other, it wasn't over. Not while there was even a single breath of hope inside these walls. And somewhere out in the tangled forest, beyond the reach of their little fire, dangers lingered. But so too did the possibility of redemption. The slow thaw of spring in Montana brings both hope and heartbreak. For weeks, Emily's cabin was cocooned in a gentle rhythm, nursing Leo, tracking poachers, and learning to accept the unpredictable mix of joy and sorrow that defined her new, makeshift family. Sunlight returned gradually, pressing through the pine boughs and scattering golden pools across the porch each morning. Every day, Emily awoke to new green shoots piercing the forest floor, and for the first time in years, she didn't mind the early call of songbirds. Leo's wounds knit together, and each morning, his wild energy seemed to rebound a little more. Emily and Ben watched, half proud, half anxious, as the cub began to push the boundaries of their little world. One morning, they caught Leo halfway up the woodpile outside, claws embedded in rough bark, tail twitching with fierce concentration. Emily laughed for the first time in weeks, an unguarded, bubbling sound that startled her as much as it did Ben. "He's got spirit," Ben said, grinning. "That's for sure." "Reminds me of someone else," Emily shot back, nudging Ben with her elbow. For a heartbeat, the tension between them flickered, replaced by something softer. She realized with a start how much she'd come to depend on his steady presence. The quiet way he handled emergencies, the rare but genuine smiles, the way he let her lean on him without judgment. Their days fell into a pattern of care and cautious optimism. Mornings started with strong coffee and soft words. Ben and Emily would plan the day's patrols, leaving Shadow in charge of Leo while they scoured the woods for traps and trespassers. At first, Emily bristled at letting someone into her routine. Her boundaries were well worn and fiercely protected. But Ben slipped easily into the spaces she didn't even know were empty, patching up fences, helping with repairs, and offering quiet support when she faltered. Shadow and Leo, too, built their own kind of friendship. The old shepherd became more than a protector. He was a mentor, guiding the cub through playful mock hunts in the long grass behind the cabin. Sometimes, Emily would glance out the window and see the pair weaving between the trees, Leo bounding ahead, Shadow lumbering patiently after him. Their games were wild and gentle at once, a dance between instinct and affection. In the evenings, the four of them would gather around the table for simple meals: beans, wild greens, sometimes venison when the hunt was good. Laughter became more common. Leo would beg for scraps, his amber eyes wide and pleading, while Shadow pretended not to notice, though Emily caught him slipping morsels to the cub more than once. Ben, for his part, told stories about his years on the road, about animals he'd saved and lost, about the people he'd met and left behind. Emily listened, often with her hand resting on Shadow's head, feeling the warmth of connection she'd almost forgotten. For years, loneliness had been her armor. Now it was softening, making room for something new and terrifying. Hope. One afternoon, as a gentle rain began to fall, Ben approached Emily on the porch. He leaned against the railing, his gaze on the distant mountains. "You know," he said, "he won't stay forever." Emily's heart skipped. She looked at Leo, sprawled in the grass with Shadow, rolling in a patch of sunlight. "I know," she replied, her voice almost a whisper. "But I'm not ready." Ben nodded, silent. The question hung between them, weighty and unresolved. When do you let go of something you've come to love? Emily had lost too much already. The idea of sending Leo back into the wild, of letting him face its dangers alone, made her stomach twist with fear and denial. "I get it," Ben said finally. "But he's not ours to keep. He's meant for the wild." The words stung, but Emily knew he was right. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling as rain pattered against the window. She thought about loss and love and all the things that can't be tamed or held. Shadow sensed her unease, jumping onto the bed and curling against her side. She buried her face in his fur, willing herself not to cry. Days passed. Leo's confidence soared. He scaled logs, stalked invisible prey, and once even chased a deer out of the yard, returning breathless, triumphant, and entirely himself. Emily and Ben began preparing him for life beyond the cabin. They introduced him to wild scents, let him practice climbing, encouraged him to hunt small prey. Each new skill was both a victory and a heartbreak. Shadow watched Leo with something like pride. The old dog's limp was more pronounced now, the cut on his paw slow to heal, but he never missed a chance to play or teach. Emily realized that letting go would be hard for all of them, not just her. One evening, after Leo and Shadow had collapsed in a heap on the rug, Ben poured 2 cups of tea and joined Emily on the porch. "You did good," he said, nodding toward the sleeping pair. "He's strong because of you." Emily swallowed. "Because of us." A long silence settled, filled only by the sounds of night. A chorus of frogs, the distant call of an owl, the hush of wind through pine. For the first time, Emily didn't feel alone in the dark. She reached over and took Ben's hand, finding comfort in the roughness of his palm, the steadiness of his grip. For a moment, the world felt safe, a fragile piece, carved out of chaos, held together by trust and the promise of tomorrow. But Emily knew it couldn't last. Sooner or later, the wild would call Leo home. All they could do was love him fiercely until that day arrived. Letting others in, Emily realized, was the bravest thing she'd ever done. And as the moon rose above the pines, she vowed to face whatever came next. With Ben, with Shadow, with the wild itself, together. The first summer storm swept in with almost no warning, a black wall of cloud boiling over the mountains, turning the sky an electric shade of green. Thunder rattled the windows of Emily's cabin and sent birds scattering from the treetops. Inside, the small family huddled together. Emily double-checked the latch on the door. Shadow curled at her feet, and Ben stacked extra wood by the fire. Leo, now almost doubled in size from when Emily first found him, prowled restlessly from window to window, his tail twitching, nose pressed to the glass. Something in the air had changed, and everyone could feel it. The storm broke just after midnight. Lightning lit up the sky, turning the forest into a flickering tangle of shadow and silver. Leo, spooked by a violent clap of thunder, bolted from the hearth and pressed his body low to the floor, his pupils wide with panic. Shadow nudged him gently, but Leo's wild instincts were awake. Another bolt split the sky. This time Leo scrambled for the door, yowling, a deep, desperate sound, raw and full of confusion. Emily rushed to stop him, but she was too late. Leo slipped through her hands, darting out the dog door Ben had rigged so Shadow could come and go. "Leo!" Emily shouted, her voice swallowed by the wind and rain. Shadow let out a sharp, anxious bark, then dashed after the cub, ignoring Emily's call. Panic shot through her. "Ben, he's gone! Shadow, too!" She grabbed her raincoat, yanked a flashlight from the counter, and sprinted into the storm. The world outside was chaos, rain slashing sideways, mud sucking at her boots, trees thrashing in the gale. Her heart pounded so loud she could barely hear herself think. Every few steps she slipped, nearly falling. "Leo! Shadow!" she called, voice hoarse. The only answer was thunder and the crack of a branch splintering nearby. She searched along the path to the woods, the beam of her flashlight bouncing wildly over sodden ferns and tangled roots. "Come on! Where are you?" Every second felt like an hour. She imagined Leo lost, hurt, or worse, her mind replaying the sight of those cruel snares Ben had found just days before. Suddenly, Shadow's bark rang out. Sharp, insistent, desperate. Emily crashed through a thicket, branches whipping her arms, and nearly tripped over Shadow, who stood just beyond a fallen log. He was barking frantically, nose pointed toward a patch of earth barely illuminated in the flashlight's trembling circle. Leo lay sprawled in the mud, his leg caught in something metallic, a trap, half buried by debris and overgrown grass. The wire was tight around his hind leg, blood soaking the ground beneath him. He thrashed in panic, teeth bared, eyes wild. Emily's breath caught. "No, not again." She forced herself to move, dropping to her knees beside Leo. The cub hissed, striking out in terror. Shadow wedged himself between Leo and Emily, barking until the cub stilled, recognizing the old dog's scent. "Good boy, Shadow. Hold him. Easy, easy." Emily's hands shook as she fumbled with the trap. Rain poured down her back, soaking her to the bone. She wedged a stick between the jaws and pried them open with all her strength. The wire snapped free, and Leo lunged away, limping but able to move. He collapsed into the grass, sides heaving. Emily's vision blurred with tears, part relief, part rage. She examined Leo's leg, cursing the poachers who'd set these traps. "You're all right, Leo. I've got you. I've got you." Shadow pressed close, licking Leo's muzzle as if urging him to hold on. It was only then that Emily noticed movement in the trees. She looked up, heart racing, and caught the glint of eyes. Two men, faces hidden by hoods, standing just at the edge of the clearing, watching her. One of them shifted, and the beam of her flashlight caught a glimpse of camouflage, the barrel of a rifle slung over a shoulder. Emily's blood ran cold. Poachers. She scooped Leo into her arms, stumbling backward, and Shadow growled, every hair on his body standing on end. The men didn't move, but Emily sensed the threat. Silent, predatory, waiting. She held her ground, refusing to turn her back, her mind racing for options. The storm seemed to roar louder, hiding the tension in its violence. Finally, the men melted away into the trees, swallowed by rain and darkness. Emily waited until she could breathe again, then hoisted Leo and hurried back toward the cabin, Shadow flanking her protectively. Her heart didn't stop pounding until the front door slammed behind them. Inside, Ben jumped up, relief flooding his face. "Are you okay?" "We found him in a trap. They were out there, Ben, watching. Poachers." Emily's voice shook with anger and exhaustion. She set Leo down by the fire and quickly wrapped his leg, her hands steady even as her mind reeled. Shadow pressed against her side, and for a moment all the fear, rage, and heartbreak of the night settled into a heavy silence. Emily drew in a shaky breath. "This can't keep happening. They're getting bolder." Ben nodded, his jaw set. "We'll call the agency in the morning. Set cameras. Whatever it takes." As dawn crept in, Leo slept, his breath finally slowing, Shadow curled around him like a shield. Emily collapsed in a chair, soaked to the skin, but she couldn't close her eyes. The wild had called Leo out into the storm and nearly taken him. Now it was calling Emily, too, to fight for the wild, no matter the cost. Somewhere outside, the poachers waited, their threat hanging over the cabin like thunder that never quite faded. But inside, for now, Emily held her patchwork family close. The battle wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. The night after the storm brought a strange, unsettling quiet to the cabin. It was the kind of silence that follows disaster, the world holding its breath, waiting for the next move. Leo slept fitfully, his wounded leg twitching in his dreams. Shadow hardly left his side, licking the cub's fur as if sheer willpower could heal him faster. Ben sat by the kitchen table, reviewing a battered map and jotting down notes. Emily, still damp from her ordeal, sipped tea that had long since gone cold, eyes glued to the window. Morning brought no relief. Leo's leg was swollen, but Ben was hopeful. "It could have been worse, Em. He'll limp, but he'll run again. He's tough." Emily nodded, brushing a stray lock of hair from her eyes, but her mind was elsewhere, on the men in the woods, the gleam of metal in the undergrowth, the gut-deep sense of threat that now lingered like a chill in the air. "We need backup," Ben said. "We need evidence." So that day, Ben and Emily set up motion-activated cameras along the property and at key trails where the poachers might pass. They hung hand-painted warning signs at every entrance to the woods, hoping to deter anyone reckless enough to return. Ben called the wildlife agency, reporting the trap, the poachers, and the close call with Leo. "We'll do what we can," the dispatcher promised, but Emily could hear the weariness in her voice. There just weren't enough rangers or deputies for the wild miles they patrolled. By nightfall, Ben had moved his sleeping bag to the living room, determined not to leave Emily and the animals alone. The air in the cabin was charged with worry, but also something else: unity, a sense that the four of them were in this together. Emily was grateful for Ben's presence, the way he made her feel braver just by being near. That week, Shadow took it upon himself to patrol the property at dusk, even with his bandaged paw. Emily tried to make him rest, but the old dog refused, leading Leo in slow, limping circuits of the cabin's clearing. Sometimes Leo would limp behind, watching Shadow's every move, his eyes bright with trust and curiosity. At other times, Leo seemed determined to prove he wasn't helpless anymore, charging ahead in bursts of wild energy, only to circle back and nuzzle Shadow's shoulder as if to say, "I still need you." On the third night, they all gathered in the living room. the fire painting their faces in orange and gold. Rain lashed the roof again, but inside, the warmth of the fire and their closeness created a fragile sense of safety. Emily sat cross-legged with Leo on a blanket at her feet. Shadow dozed nearby, occasionally opening one eye to make sure everyone was where they should be. Ben brewed coffee, his movements methodical, his presence solid. As the storm deepened, Emily found herself opening up more to Ben, talking about her late husband, the loneliness that had become both armor and prison, her fear of letting anyone close. Ben listened, his hand warm on her back, sometimes squeezing her shoulder when words failed her. In the quiet moments, their connection deepened. The lines between ally and something more began to blur, comfort blooming into a gentle, tentative hope. A sudden snap outside jerked them all to attention. Shadow was on his feet in an instant, growling low in his chest. Ben grabbed a flashlight in Emily's hand, nodding for her to stay close. Leo slunk behind the couch, hackles raised. Emily's heart hammered as they stepped onto the porch, scanning the tree line for movement. Nothing but rain and the wild sway of branches. Emily exhaled, shaky with adrenaline. Ben checked the camera feed from his phone. No sign of intruders, only the shimmer of deer passing through, their eyes reflecting back at the lens. Still, the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. They returned inside, locking the doors and windows tight. Shadow settled by the door, refusing to budge, his eyes sharp and vigilant. Leo curled beside him, drawing comfort from the old dog's unwavering presence. The next morning, Ben reviewed the camera footage again. This time, there was no mistaking what he saw. Two men, faces masked, moving carefully through the trees. One carried a rifle, the other a heavy pack, likely full of snares. They were methodical, checking and resetting traps with practiced hands. The timestamp matched the time of the storm. Emily's anger burned. They came back. They're hunting in the park, using my land as cover. Ben nodded, jaw clenched. I'll send this to the authorities. It's enough to get them moving. They both knew it might take time for the agency to send help, but the evidence made them feel less powerless, more resolved. That afternoon, a game warden arrived, listened to their account, and promised to increase patrols. You've done the right thing, he told Emily. But be careful. Poachers this bold don't scare easy. As the sun set, painting the mountains in fiery gold, Emily, Ben, Shadow, and Leo huddled together in the living room. There was fear in the air, but also strength. They'd survived another trial, weathered the storm, protected one another, and fought back against the threat that stalked the wild beyond their door. Later, as the house grew quiet and sleep finally came, Emily reached out to rest her hand on Shadow's broad back. He thumped his tail just once, as if to say, "We're still here. We're still fighting." And as the fire flickered low, Emily knew, whatever came next, they would face it together, bound not just by fear and necessity, but by love and loyalty forged in danger. The following nights settled on the cabin heavy as a held breath. Emily felt it in her bones, the electric tension of the forest. Each twig snap outside, each flicker of shadow beneath the pines, sent adrenaline through her veins. Even the birds seemed to sense something was coming. Their songs faded to uneasy silence at dusk, replaced by the whisper of wind through the needles and the occasional distant, lonely howl. Inside, life pressed on with an air of vigilance. Ben checked the motion cameras every morning, sharing silent looks with Emily as they watched the footage. Deer, foxes, sometimes a coyote, but every so often, a blurred shape that didn't belong. Shadow patrolled the porch at night, favoring his wounded paw, but never once asking to be let inside. Leo had grown more restless, his wild instincts stronger now. He prowled the edge of the property, pacing, sometimes letting out long, yowling cries that echoed eerily into the darkness. On the fourth night, just after midnight, the tension finally broke. Emily had barely drifted into uneasy sleep when Shadow's sharp, frantic bark shattered the quiet. She jolted awake, heart hammering, and found Ben already pulling on his boots. Shadow's barking turned urgent, a warning, not a greeting. Leo, roused by the commotion, let out a wild, guttural cry and darted for the door. "Stay here!" Emily called over her shoulder as she snatched the heavy flashlight and the radio, but she knew Ben and Leo would be right behind her. Outside, the night was thick with fog, every sound amplified and distorted. Shadow stood near the edge of the yard, tail bristling, teeth bared. His bark was thunder in the stillness. As Emily swept her flashlight through the trees, the beam caught movement. Two men, faces masked, moving low and fast along the back fence. The wire sparkled where it had been cut. One of the men raised a rifle. Emily's breath caught. "Get back!" she shouted, voice fierce, but her fear trembled underneath. Shadow lunged, barking so loud the sound echoed through the woods. Leo, wild and unafraid, leapt into the fray with a chilling scream, his body all sinew and fury. The poachers hesitated just a moment too long. Behind Emily, Ben was already shouting into the radio. "This is Ben Walker, Glacier Boundary. We have intruders, armed, repeat. We need backup now." The scene unraveled in a flash. One man fired into the air, the crack deafening. Leo slashed at his legs, making him stumble. Shadow darted in, teeth snapping. The second man tried to grab Leo, but Shadow flung himself at the attacker, his jaws finding the man's arm. Blood sprayed across the undergrowth. Emily raced forward, swinging her flashlight. "Get away from them!" she screamed, but the men broke and ran, crashing into the forest, leaving blood and shredded fabric in their wake. The moment stretched and snapped back. Shadow whined, stumbling, blood oozing from his flank. Ben rushed to him, hands shaking. "Easy, boy. I've got you. Emily, help me." Leo circled back, fur bristling, hackles raised, but at Emily's word he slunk to her side, still growling deep in his chest. The chaos faded into urgent whispers. Ben wrapping Shadow's wound with his shirt. Emily holding Leo close. Radio crackling with the dispatcher's promise. "Help is on the way. Stay safe. Don't engage." They retreated into the cabin, barricading the door, adrenaline making their hands clumsy. Leo paced the room, eyes never leaving the door. Shadow collapsed on the rug, panting, his fur slick with sweat and blood. Emily pressed a towel to his wound, willing him to hold on. "Stay with me, Shadow. Please, buddy. Please." Ben moved like a man in a dream, his voice low and steady, grounding Emily as she fought the rising panic. "He's strong. He's survived worse." Minutes felt like hours. Then the red and blue strobes of ranger trucks cut through the darkness. Uniformed officers fanned out, flashlights sweeping the property. The relief nearly brought Emily to her knees. Rangers radioed in. The poachers had been caught trying to flee down a muddy back road, bloodied and desperate. A cache of traps and illegal weapons was discovered in their truck. The news spread through town before sunrise. Emily's cabin, once just a mark on the map, was now a symbol of the fight for the wild. By dawn, the storm had passed, and with it, the threat that had haunted Emily for so long. But the cost was written in every line of Shadow's tired face, in every cautious glance Leo cast toward the forest. As Ben helped the officers gather evidence, Emily sat on the porch with Shadow's head in her lap. She stroked his fur gently, feeling the old dog's heartbeat, steady but weak. "You saved us, big guy," she whispered, tears falling unchecked. "You're a hero. Always were." Leo pressed close, nuzzling Shadow's neck, a fierce loyalty shining in his golden eyes. Emily wrapped her arms around both of them, letting herself grieve for all the danger, for the wounds seen and unseen. Ben knelt beside her, his presence a silent anchor. Later that morning, the local news crew arrived. Leo's story, Shadow's courage, and Emily's stand inspired the whole town. Strangers brought food, blankets, even handmade thank you cards. For the first time, Emily didn't feel like a recluse or an outsider. She felt like a survivor, like someone who had finally made a difference. Inside, as Shadow drifted to sleep, Ben touched Emily's shoulder. "We did it," he said. "You did it. The wild is safer tonight, because you refused to give up." Emily nodded, the weight of everything sinking in. The fight wasn't over, not really, but the hardest part was behind them. She looked at Ben, at Shadow, at Leo, and finally let herself believe it. Together, they could face anything the wild sent their way. Summer drifted slowly into late July, and the land softened under the sun's golden gaze. In the aftermath of the confrontation, the forest itself seemed to breathe easier. Rangers patrolled the area more frequently, the fences were repaired, and the threat of poachers faded, at least for now. But inside Emily's cabin, another kind of tension had begun to build, quiet and bittersweet. Shadow, bandaged and bruised but ever loyal, healed in the way old warriors do, slowly, with patience and grit. He limped now, a hitch in his step that made Emily's heart squeeze with gratitude and sorrow. Sometimes, he slept so deeply that Emily would check his breathing just to be sure. But his eyes still sparkled with the wisdom of many hard winters, and his tail thumped whenever Leo entered the room. Leo was different now, bigger, stronger, and more restless by the day. The wild in him was no longer just a flicker, but a constant burning force. He paced the cabin at night, nose pressed to the windows, gaze fixed on the dark tree line. He spent hours sitting at the back door, tail twitching, ears pricked for distant sounds Emily could never quite hear. She knew what it meant. They all did. Ben was the first to say it out loud, one late evening as they watched Leo circle the porch, then stare into the trees, his breath coming in eager pants. "He's ready, Em, or near enough. If we keep him longer, he'll lose what makes him wild." Emily's chest tightened. She had seen it before. Animals so used to people that they never quite belonged anywhere again. She wanted more time, but she also wanted Leo to have a real life. Freedom, challenge, the thrill of moonlight and prey. Still, the thought of letting him go left a hollow ache in her gut. Ben rested a hand on her shoulder. "We can soft release him, monitor with a collar. If he struggles, we'll know. But it's time." That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She sat by Shadow's side, her hand tangled in his fur as Leo prowled the shadows beyond the porch. The memories came in a rush. The day she found him, half dead and shivering. The way he had learned to trust Shadow, to play, to chase, to fight for life. She had been so sure she was saving him, but maybe he had saved her too, teaching her to hope again, to risk connection. The next morning, they began to prepare. Ben arranged for a tracking collar, gathering supplies with quiet efficiency. Emily cooked Leo's favorite meal, a mix of venison and eggs, and set it out as a small farewell feast. Shadow lay nearby, watching, his head resting on his paws, eyes never leaving Leo. In the afternoon, Ben and Emily led Leo to the edge of the forest. Emily's heart pounded as she clipped the collar gently around his neck. Leo squirmed, unhappy with the fuss, but stilled when Shadow stepped forward, touching noses with him in a final, silent lesson. The forest was alive with late summer sounds. Wind in the pines, birds calling, insects buzzing. Leo sniffed the air, muscles trembling with anticipation. Emily knelt, pressing her forehead gently to his. "You're ready," she whispered, voice thick. "Remember what Shadow taught you. Remember you're wild." Ben opened the gate. Leo hesitated for just a heartbeat, looking back at them, at Emily, at Ben, at Shadow, then slipped into the trees, moving with a grace that took Emily's breath away. He vanished almost at once, nothing but a blur of gold and muscle and possibility. Emily stood, silent, her hands balled into fists. She had thought she would cry, but instead she felt a kind of peace, a release, as if some knot inside her had finally come undone. Ben moved beside her, wordless, offering his presence instead of platitudes. Shadow pressed against her knee, looking into the woods as if he too was sending a piece of his heart away. They lingered at the edge of the forest until sunset painted the sky in streaks of violet and fire. The house felt impossibly empty that night. The air was thick with absence. Emily caught herself listening for Leo's familiar footfalls, searching for his golden shape in every shadow. But the house was quieter now. The rhythm changed. News from the rangers trickled in over the next days. Leo was adapting. He was hunting, traveling farther each night. Once, a ranger's trail camera captured him slinking through the undergrowth with another young mountain lion. Curious, wary, but free. Emily saved the photo, staring at it for long minutes. Heart swelling with pride and longing, she spent more time outside with Shadow, walking the trails, sharing stories with Ben by the fire. Some evenings they sat in silence, watching the woods, each lost in their own memories. The ache of letting go didn't vanish, but it softened, transformed by gratitude, pride, and a gentle hope for the future. One evening, as a gentle rain fell, Emily stood at the tree line, Shadow leaning into her side. She raised her voice in a quiet promise. "You'll always have a home here, Leo, no matter where you go." Behind her, Ben placed a warm hand on her shoulder. "You did good, Em. You gave him the best chance." She nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. Letting go wasn't losing, she realized. It was loving fiercely enough to set someone free. That night, as the wild called and the fire glowed, Emily finally allowed herself to rest, trusting that somewhere out there, Leo was learning to live on his own terms, wild and whole. As the first hint of autumn crept into the Montana air, Emily noticed how the sun lingered lower in the sky, bathing the pine woods in honeyed light. The scent of wild sage and fallen needles carried a note of nostalgia. Life at the cabin settled into a new rhythm, a quieter one, but not without meaning. Shadow, though slower now, remained Emily's steadfast companion. His limp was permanent, but his spirit shone with a quiet dignity. Emily no longer worried over every shallow breath. She cherished them instead, counting each one as a gift. Together, they resumed their daily patrols, greeting the turning season with a kind of reverence. Sometimes, Ben joined them, and the three moved through the forest as a team, watchful, grateful, and somehow more whole for all they'd endured. Leo's absence was a living thing at first, pressing into the corners of every day. Emily caught herself glancing at the porch steps, expecting a tawny flash of fur, or listening for the soft yowl of a mountain lion cub demanding breakfast. But the emptiness slowly filled with something else: pride, hope, and the quiet knowledge that the wild she'd helped nurture was finding its way. The town, once indifferent to Emily's solitary life, now viewed her with new respect. Children from the school hiked out to the cabin, wide-eyed and full of questions about Leo, about mountain lions, about courage and kindness. Emily surprised herself by accepting the invitations to speak, first to a handful of rangers in training, then to a classroom of eager kids at the local schoolhouse. She found her voice growing steadier, her stories reaching beyond her own heart and into the communities. She spoke not just of Leo and Shadow, but of all the wild creatures who needed a chance. Foxes, bears, eagles, and even the tiniest chipmunks and field mice. Her lessons weren't about taming or controlling nature. They were about respect, stewardship, and letting wild things be wild. Young rangers took note, scribbling in their notebooks. Some of them inspired enough to sign up for volunteer shifts at the park. Shadow became a legend in his own right. On patrols, he moved with stately pride, accepting gentle pats from children and the occasional treat from an admiring neighbor. His muzzle was grayer than ever, his steps more deliberate, but his eyes never lost their intelligence. Even Ben, usually reserved, seemed to relax in Shadow's presence, and their partnership with Emily deepened in ways words didn't always capture. In the evenings, Ben and Emily would host campfire gatherings for the youth volunteers. They roasted marshmallows, swapped stories of close calls and wild rescues, and, as dusk settled, listened for the calls of coyotes or the rustle of deer passing nearby. Sometimes Emily would feel a deep contentment settle over her, a peace she'd thought was lost forever. Then, one crisp morning, as frost glazed the porch and the world sparkled in the new light, Emily noticed something strange by the creek. She was leading a group of young rangers on an early patrol, Shadow trotting at her side, when she spotted the tracks, big, round, and unmistakable. Mountain lion. But not just any lion. These prints were larger now, heavier, more assured. Emily knelt, brushing her fingers over the chilled mud, feeling her heart leap. "Is it him?" whispered one of the rangers, a girl named Chloe, her eyes wide with awe. Emily nodded, barely daring to believe. "I think so. Leo's grown." They followed the tracks down to the water's edge, where the print of a second, smaller lion appeared beside the first. Emily smiled, a lump in her throat, as Shadow sniffed the tracks and let out a quiet, approving woof. That evening, back at the cabin, Emily wrote the moment in her journal, her words spilling out with gratitude. "He came home. Not to stay, but to remind me. The wild never really leaves us, not if we've loved it right." News of Leo's return spread, inspiring another wave of visitors and calls. A local magazine asked for an interview. The Park Service invited Emily to mentor a new group of rangers. She found herself stepping into the role of teacher and guide, helping others navigate the wild's hardships and gifts. Among the new rangers was a young man named Dylan, fresh from college, brimming with knowledge but still green in the field. Emily saw in him a familiar uncertainty, a longing to prove himself, a fear of making mistakes. She remembered her own early days, full of doubts and hopes, and quietly took him under her wing. Together with Ben, they showed Dylan how to set humane traps, track animals, and listen to the rhythm of the woods. One chilly night, after a long day's patrol, Emily and Ben sat on the porch, Shadow asleep at their feet. They watched the stars emerge, one by one, bright and cold above the black line of pines. You ever think about moving? Ben asked, his voice low, thoughtful. Emily smiled, shaking her head. This place is my home. The wild's in my bones now. Besides, I'm finally where I'm supposed to be. Ben reached for her hand, and Emily laced her fingers with his, feeling the steady warmth of his grip. The silence between them was comfortable, full of all the things they didn't need to say. As the wind shifted, Emily thought she heard a distant, familiar cry, the wild, calling, answering, always returning. She closed her eyes, letting it wash over her, trusting that she was exactly where she belonged. And in that moment, Emily understood. Letting go wasn't the end. Sometimes the wild returns, not just in paw prints or distant echoes, but in every new beginning, every heart willing to listen and care. As the last golden leaves clung to the aspens and the first frost hardened the earth, another year spun quietly toward its end in the Montana wilderness. Emily's cabin stood as it always had, sturdy, weathered, surrounded by the wild, and yet everything felt changed. Not just in the cabin, but in Emily herself, in the people who visited, in the stories that echoed through the trees. On the night of the first true cold, Emily lit a fire in the old stone ring beneath the pines. The flames leapt high, sending sparks spinning toward a star-studded sky. She had invited the people who mattered most: Ben, Shadow, a handful of young rangers, and several neighbors who had become friends through shared trials. Even Chloe and Dylan came, their faces bright with pride and anticipation, eager to share what they'd learned during their first year in the wild. There was food, simple, hearty dishes, set out on rough-hewn tables: venison stew, cornbread, wild berry jam. Steam rose in fragrant clouds as laughter and stories circled the fire. For Emily, this gathering was more than a celebration. It was a promise kept, a recognition that every hardship had led them here, together, stronger for what they'd faced and what they'd let go. Shadow sat close to Emily, his muzzle fully gray, eyes soft but still sharp. Every so often he'd look toward the trees, ears perked, as if waiting for Leo, or perhaps the wild itself, to reappear. Ben kept a gentle hand on Shadow's side, the old dog pressed close in a kind of silent communion. The animal's scars were visible now, reminders of battles won and survived, but his spirit was unbroken. As darkness deepened, the group fell into a thoughtful hush. Emily rose, cradling a mug of spiced cider, and stepped into the firelight's glow. She looked around at the faces, young and old, new and familiar, and felt a wave of gratitude so deep she could barely speak at first. When I first came here, she began, her voice steady but thick with emotion, I thought the wild was something I had to conquer, or at least survive. I thought I'd lost everything that mattered, and that the world outside these woods would forget me. She paused, glancing down at Shadow, whose eyes reflected the flames. But I was wrong. The wild isn't about loss. It's about what you're willing to risk, and who you're willing to care for, even when it hurts. The group listened, some smiling, some with tears shining in their eyes. Chloe gave Emily a little nod, her hands clasped tight, Dylan's arm around her shoulders. Shadow taught me that loyalty isn't just about standing guard, but about staying, even when things get hard. Ben taught me that healing takes time, and sometimes you have to let others help. Leo, well, he reminded me that the wild doesn't take, not really. It gives. But only if you care enough to listen. Only if you're willing to protect what's precious and let go when the time comes. She raised her mug in a quiet toast. To the wild, to the ones we've lost, and the ones we've found. To every act of kindness, big or small. Because in the end, that's what lasts. That's what changes everything. The fire crackled, and for a long moment, no one spoke. The sound of wind in the trees filled the silence, a soft, ancient music. Then Ben stepped beside Emily, his arm encircling her waist, grounding her in the present. As the gathering wound down, people lingered in the warmth, sharing stories beneath the towering pines. Chloe and Dylan sang an old folk tune. Some of the youngest rangers asked Emily to retell the story of Leo's rescue. She obliged, weaving humor and heartache into her words, watching as their eyes grew wide with wonder and admiration. Later, after everyone had left, Emily remained by the embers, Shadow's head on her knee, Ben sitting quietly beside her. The moon cast a silver path through the branches. Somewhere deep in the woods, a mountain lion called, a clear, wild sound echoing between the hills. Emily closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her. Shadow's breathing was slow and deep, but his eyes were bright. Emily stroked his fur, grateful for every day they'd shared. "You did good, old friend," she whispered. "You're part of this place. You always will be." Ben squeezed her hand. "You built something here, Em. More than a cabin. You built a legacy." Emily thought of Leo, free, wild, maybe watching them from the darkness, maybe already far away. She thought of the young rangers, the children from town, the neighbors who now called her by name. She thought of the risks she'd taken, the wounds that had healed, the love that had surprised her and refused to let go. "Maybe that's what the wild asks of us," she said softly. "To pay attention, to love fiercely, to let go again and again, and trust that what's meant to stay will find its way back." As the last coals died and the cold crept close, Emily felt peace settle deep in her bones. Nothing loved is ever truly lost, she realized. The wild holds every story, every act of courage, every moment of grace. She rose, gathering Shadow close, Ben at her side, and turned toward the cabin. The fire might have faded, but the light remained, woven into every tree, every trail, every heart touched by kindness. If this story moved you, remember the wild needs all of us. Our protection, our respect, our willingness to let go and trust. Support your local wildlife rescue. Teach your children to listen, and never doubt the power of a single act of kindness. Because in the end, the wild gives back what we give to it: love, hope, and the courage to begin again.